Go. We're looking at the technology of warfare. I think it's a great topic to prepare. It's a big one for a higher level, but if you do an ordinary level, you could easily be asked to write about this. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to go through the boxes. You already have the mind map. And remember, at ordinary level, if you just knew the headings in the boxes and wrote a paragraph briefly explaining the various different headings, you're grand. At higher level, each one of these boxes is like the basis for a paragraph, or certainly half of a paragraph. So the question is on technology of warfare and how technical change influenced the outcome of World War II. So we talked in class, what are the 6 elements or 7 elements? Computing, radar, aviation, atomic bomb, medical advances, tanks, and D-Day, right? Those are your key. So if you're doing higher level, that's your paragraph topics. If you're doing ordinary level, that's the guts of your paragraph. And then add in a few little details from the boxes. So really, really fast. Computing, we know, was not a very advanced in the 1930s, but the investment that was put into computing, particularly into code-breaking computers in the 1940s during the war, led to great advances later on in the post-war period. The things to mention are the ENIAC machine, which was developed in the US as a way of processing lots of information really quickly. And then, of course, Bletchley Park in the UK. Bletchley Park was where Alan Turing and his team of code breakers developed the bomb, which was a prototype computer, big, huge thing, bloody size of a room, which was used to decode the Enigma machine. And the decoding of the Enigma machine was a vital step in Britain's ability to, first of all, survive and then win the Battle of the Atlantic. So in terms of computing, there's loads there. Now, speaking of the Battle of the Atlantic, radar and actually sonar, which is a way of detecting movement in water, those were technologies that were very, very important to the outcome of the war. Radar was invented by Robert Watson Watt in the 1930s. In the 1940s, during the war, the development of the cavity magnetron device helped to develop accurate radar. And of course, Britain's ability to track the Luftwaffe groups as they came in over Britain during those fatal months of August and early September 1940 were vital in the RAF's ability to win the Battle of Britain. In the post-war, the wartime developments in radar, of course, gave a huge impetus or thrust, excuse the pun, into the aviation industry. The aviation industry, again, one more pun, took off after the Second World War. And the reason it did was because, well, you can't fly planes around if you don't know where they are. And radar allowed the aviation industry to create the interconnected world we have today. Don't forget as well, if you have a microwave in your house and you want to switch it on and defrost something or cook something, the reason you can do it is because of the development of the cavity magnetron, which was developed in order to improve radar technology in World War II. I mentioned aviation. Aviation, of course, this was the war where aviation really came to the fore. You know, if you think about the Pacific and the battles between the US Navy and the Japanese Navy, it was a battle between aircraft carriers. So who had the advantage in aviation was going to have the advantage in the war. From the very beginning of the war, the mass bombing of civilian centres was clearly going to be a part of military tactics. It was introduced by the Germans when they blitzed Britain, these bombings of cities like Coventry, Belfast, London, Liverpool, Glasgow, Coventry, I think I mentioned Coventry, and all those places. The Germans had, at the start of the war, a very effective bomber called the Heinkel, but by the time the war was over, the Heinkel looked like a piece of Lego compared to a jumbo jet because the Americans had developed the Boeing B-29 Super Fortress, which was able to deliver massive payloads of explosives onto German cities by the time the war was over. In terms of fighter aircraft, the Germans had a Messerschmitt 109, which at the beginning of the war was a very effective fighter, but had a very short range and couldn't accompany its bombers and therefore give protection. Similarly, Britain had the Spitfire and the Hurricane, which were vital to their success in the Battle of Britain, but the Spitfire and the Hurricane, which were really excellent aircraft, were propeller aircraft that again had a limited range. The two best fighter aircraft of the war were the Japanese Mitsubishi Zero, and the best one was developed in 1943-44, and it changed aerial warfare in the second half of the Second World War, and that was the US P-51 Mustang. The P-51 Mustang was faster, easier to fly, more maneuverable, and it made a massive difference in the battle with the Luftwaffe, and it could accompany bombers on long-range missions. One of the big outcomes of the war, or one of the big races in the war, was to develop the jet engine. The jet engine, which was key to the development of the later aviation industry, was invented by Frank Whittle in his shed in the 1930s. Man was a genius, we should all know his name. But the development of the engine into something which could be mass produced in order to create aircraft that could be used in the war, that didn't really happen, despite massive investment from both the Germans and the Americans. That didn't really happen until the war was nearly over. So the Germans produced the Heinkel 178, which was their prototype jet, but never really became functional and operational. And the British produced the Gloster Meteor, which again never really became functional. Shortly after the war, jet engine development had meant that propeller aircraft were defunct, and all of the militaries of the world used jets. One thing to mention, the Germans developed V1 and V2 rockets. Those V1 and V2 rockets were essentially intercontinental. Well, they were ballistic missiles, which were, in other words, you can fire them from point A and direct them at point B. And that technology was developed during the Second World War. The atomic bomb, as we know, game changer. Massive amount of money invested in the development of the atomic bomb by the Americans in a top secret project called the Manhattan Project. The head of the Manhattan Project was Robert Oppenheimer, and by the time 1945 came around, they developed functional bombs which had an explosive capacity beyond anything anybody ever imagined, as was evident when they were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. Don't forget, changes in medicine, also a good paragraph topic here. Alexander Fleming, the accidental tourist who, went off on holidays and came back and had discovered penicillin. But penicillin and the exploitation of penicillin and the widespread use of penicillin was crucial for reducing casualty rates during the war. But also there were developments in antibiotics, blood transfusions and skin grafts, and advances in trauma surgery. All of these things were vital in allowing soldiers who were terribly badly wounded to survive the war. Nearly there now. Tanks. This was a war that was in which tanks were very, very, very important. The Germans had their Panzers, and probably the best tank in the war was the Tiger tank, but it was so expensive to produce that they weren't able to produce it in the numbers they needed. It was effective when working with infantry in blitzkrieg tactics. The most effective tank of the war in terms of numbers and success in the battlefield was the Soviet T-34. The British had the Churchill, the Americans had the Sherman. But if you want to see who won the war, well, the Russians and the Soviets won the Battle of Kursk in 1943, where they wiped out Germany's tank capacity. That battle, there were 6,000 tanks, and the battle took 3 days. And by the time it was over, there was no doubt that while the German tanks were technically brilliantly designed, the T-34 was the killer, and the T-34 won that war in the Eastern Front. Finally, D-Day. Know your paragraph on D-Day. The 6th of June 1944. Why was it successful? Many reasons, one of them being technology. Talk about the development of landing craft that could deliver troops right up onto the beaches. Talk about Hobart's funnies, which were used to disable German defences. Talk about the construction of the Mulberry harbours, which were dragged across the English Channel up onto French beaches so they could unload the heavy machinery in the tanks. Talk about Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean, where they were able to bring fuel from Britain to France because they knew the Germans would destroy the fuel depots. And finally, just simple things, mobile radio communication, which was developed specifically for the battlefield, and it meant that these massive armies that were under the command of Eisenhower during those vital weeks of June and August 1944, that they were able to coordinate those armies. So there's how technology impacted on the Second World War. Study that mind map.